Hello everyone and welcome to UnHerd for this emergency live special covering the general election that has just been announced. Within the last few minutes, we've been watching Prime Minister Rishi Sunak coming to a very rainy podium outside number 10 Downing Street and announcing that he's spoken to the King, he's done the formalities, and it is going to be July the 4th, which means that Parliament in a few days will be dissolved and we'll be into a 6-week general election campaign. With me to try and work out what this means and how a government at the end of 5 years came to this surprising conclusion is none other than Tom McTague, our very own political editor, and also Lee Cain. So Lee is actually one of the masterminds of the 2019 general election. He worked for Boris Johnson alongside Dominic Cummings and then became the head of the communications department in number 10 Downing Street. He worked incredibly closely in the early years of this Tory government. So Lee, I'll start with you. I mean, this is a project that you were intimately involved with. You were there at the start, and now you're here with us looking at the end, 5 years later. I have to ask, first of all, why now?
I suppose that, in 97 we had things can only get better. There might be a perception in number 10 that things can only get worse. We've got probably a difficult summer with, more small boats likely to come at the tail end. NHS waiting lists are still very difficult. Will probably, get worse again as we get into sort of, September, October time. So, with inflation, sort of, good news today, they may be thinking, actually, this is a small landing zone where we might just be in the best sort of space. But, there's not a huge amount of positive options for them, I would say.
It's quite a sort of indictment, isn't it? That if this is the best moment they can find, what would a worse moment look like? As you said, they're 24% behind in the opinion polls. They're about to have all of these things coming forward. It's just a dismal ending, isn't it, of this government?
I think it is. It's very disappointing. I was obviously one of the strategists in 2019, and at that point, the country was promised change and significant change. And I think you have to look back and say that as a party, we've not delivered the change that people wanted. And I think the opinion polls are a signifier of that. And, people do want change.
So I really want to come back to that, because that is the fascinating thing, isn't it? To zoom out a bit, we've had this 5 years, that project that we all got so interested in 2019 is completely unraveled. But before we do that, Tom, what's your sense of why now? What any interesting details you picked up today?
Well, I think Lee's right. It's a sort of this. They've decided that this is the best that it can get. I mean, I would add to some of the things Lee mentioned, like the Bank of England today said that even though inflation has come down, that actually it might tick up again towards the end of the year. So there's another reason why if you go in November, you've lost everything. All of your promises seem to have disappeared.
How's he doing on his promises then? So there were 5 big promises. What's the scorecard looking like?
I think he has reached some of them. So he promised to halve inflation. He's done that. He promised to grow the economy. The economy is now growing. Technically growing. He promised to cut NHS waiting lists. That hasn't happened. I think there is some evidence that they might be sort of tickling down.
Promised to stop the boats.
Promised to stop the boats. That hasn't happened, depending on how you measure it. I think they're at pretty much a kind of the record level of a couple of years ago already. So he's not hitting his targets. His targets that he thought were easily achievable, he's not hitting those. So, I mean, but if you pull the camera back even further, this is a government with record high taxes. It's the first government since the war that is leaving with disposable incomes below when they came into office. This is a terrible record. NHS waiting times, as Lee said, are something like 4 times higher than they were in 2010. I think there was 2 point something million on the waiting list back then. It's way over 7, approaching 8 now million. This is just a terrible record to have to defend. So what is he going on? He's going to go on Rwanda. This is one clear bit.
Rwanda, which hasn't been tried and hasn't started. I think he made a bet with Piers Morgan that the flights would take off before the election. That won't have happened.
Well, it might. So let's imagine the campaign underway, and then the flights the first flight starts to take off. He then has a press conference and he says the Labour Party would block this from happening. This will work. And then he doesn't have to defend a record of small boats crossing over the summer because the election will have happened beforehand. So there is some logic, I guess, to that. But I could imagine somebody like Boris Johnson being able to exploit that better than Rishi Sunak.
It doesn't, I mean, we were just watching together his statement outside Number 10. Not that any of this should matter, but the rain was pouring, it was dripping off his shoulders. There were protesters doing quite a successful job at ruining his speech. The mood just felt quite dismal, and it's a million miles away from that sunshiny mood in the 2019 when it was this sense that something interesting at the very least was happening. It was a new coalition of voters. There were a whole bunch of new voters for Boris Johnson. Looking back, what is your diagnosis of how that project, which you were really a key part in? I mean, I'm going to remind the viewers here that you were called Premier Lee when Boris Johnson was in hospital because you were running the country, basically. I mean, you were absolutely integral to that project, and now it's just lies in ruins.
I think I'd point out that the weather at that time was also equally as grim, if not more so, being in sort of mid-December for the election. But yeah, I think your assessment is correct. I think it does feel pretty gloomy, and I think some of that will be Rishi's. We take responsibility for that. I think some of the things he inherited a pretty difficult hand as well. I think from the perspective of where we were in 2019, we came in at a time, again with Brexit, when, people felt there was a gridlock. They felt that Parliament was in stasis, that nothing was really happening. And, it was quite clear to us that we had to represent Boris as, he's the change candidate. He's someone who he believes in Brexit. But, we knew instantly that part of the challenge was, while it was going to be a Brexit election, we had to, find a way to unite people on all sides. And the sort of, the Get Brexit Done messaging was there to sort of, people who knew that, if they wanted to leave, or actually if they were someone who voted to remain, but still thought actually was, we need to move forwards, it appealed to everybody. And the core thing is from day one with Boris, as soon as we got through the door in that July, we were in sort of campaign mode. So if you notice at that point, we'd have him at a school, we'd have him at a hospital, we'd have him at a police station, and he'd be there. You'd have the start of the BBC News, you'd have, the usual sort of rabble in the House, Dominic Grieve, whoever else, talking about, the latest problems and blockages. Then second item's Boris saying, yep, we're going to get Brexit done. Then we're going to, fix the things, your priorities, the things that you care about. New hospitals, more nurses, better schools, tougher on crime, the things that we know that, people out there want to have solved. And that change message really resonated. People saw that, okay, this is someone who's doing things differently. We look at, prorogation, which didn't work out, but sent a signal that he was actually serious on doing something, delivering. You look at removing the whip from MPs who didn't want to support the Brexit plan we had. Again, if you look at the sort of media narrative, then it was, Boris in crisis, it's all going to be a mess. But the signal to the country was someone who was determined to deliver. And we were rewarded for that in the election with a huge majority. So, he's been given a huge amount of authority from the electorate to go on now and deliver on those things that you've promised. You've made the correct diagnosis, go and deliver it. But unfortunately, there's a trap fall into that I think, consecutive governments have for quite a long time now, where they raise the salience of issues, they, assess the challenges, but they're simply not delivering on the problem. And I think people have really lost faith in politicians, ability to deliver for them.
I mean, that is the really serious thing that's happened in the past 5 years, isn't it? That those voters, some of them were first-time voters. There were definitely people who were trying new parties out. It was almost the last roll of the dice that conventional politicians could actually deliver. That it had that populist feel, but it was still going to be somehow manageable. And my sense over the past 5 years is a lot of those voters are now just switching off completely. They're giving up on, it's not just the Tories, they're giving up on Labour. There's a real sense that Westminster just doesn't work.
I think that's true. And I think one of the things that people haven't really focused on yet, but I think will become quite apparent, is the sort of enthusiasm deficit that Keir Starmer has. It's probably been well documented that, if you look at any focus groups, quite a lot of them, so a lot of focus groups, a lot of polling, people will quite obviously say, and basically, I'm not really sure about Labour and Keir, but I just want to get rid of the Tories. They had my vote, got to go. And I think if you look at Keir's numbers, we can see that actually they're pretty poor for someone with such huge party polls. His personal polls are pretty poor. So I think when he does step into number 10, which is likely as we get into July, he's going to have a very short window to actually show people, A, that he can diagnose the issues that are important to them, and then B, to show some delivery. And I think if he gets that wrong, much like Rishi Sunak, which we saw after the first 3 months, people, did have a look at him. They thought, you're a good chancellor. We'll give you a go. And then they felt that he was, just wasn't going to deliver for them, and his polling just slipped away. And you can see that enthusiasm for him went. It could be the same situation with Keir if he doesn't get it right pretty quickly. I think there's a very short window for him to get it right. And then you could have this very strange situation with a party with a pretty overwhelming majority in the House, with a leader who's just come through the door and actually had very little public support, which, again, it'd be a very strange scenario to be in.
So do you think there is room for new things to come out of this? Sounds like, quite likely, the frustration people feel might just get worse under a Labour government, and their sense that the main parties are not even relevant to them might just increase. Your old friend and colleague Dominic Cummings has been talking about launching a new political party. What's the name for it? I forget. He's branded it.
I think he's just talking about the Startup Party at the moment. But I think it's a sort of holding name, I suspect.
What do you think? Do you think there's room for new parties? Is that going to happen? And what do you think about reform's chances? So
I think in a first past the post system, it's incredibly difficult for a new party to make significant headway. However, I think if Labour do not deliver within the first year or two when they move it, and the public are looking and thinking, well, the Conservatives will probably take a long time to try and get themselves reorganised and serious again. That might take a incredibly long time when you look at what's going to be left in terms of talent pool. If Labour also aren't delivering, people will start to cast glances elsewhere. Now, there's a big difference between being a reform type movement, getting sort of 15 to 20% in the polls and shaping elections and having an impact and removing voters from certain parties.
So just to say, is that what you think they'll get then, reform, 15 to 20%?
Well, they're currently sort of around about 15% in the polls, aren't they? That's sort of where they're hovering through, which again will eat away at the Conservative seats and margins, which would be very, obviously very difficult for them. So, but I think these things can shape the outcomes of elections. But there's obviously a huge step forward to be in that situation, to actually be looking like you can have an electable governing party. I think that's, we've obviously not seen it in 100 years or so. So it'd be a huge jump. But,
So you're not getting on board the new Dominic Cummings party?
Well, I would never count Dominic out. I have to say, there's a few times where I've thought he, wouldn't be able to pull something off, and he does tend to manage to. So he's not someone that, if anyone could do it, it would be him. But it's a very tall order.
Tom, what do you think? Is this, if we're searching for the big picture trend here, will it be a reform story? Will there be other new things coming out of this? And do you share Lee's analysis that actually, fast forward 3 or 6 or 9 months, most people might just be even more angry, even more let down, because there's not a lot that Labour can really do.
Yeah, it's true that Keir Starmer has this, what did you call it?
Enthusiasm deficit.
I think that's true. But even historically, if you look at Boris Johnson's poll ratings, they're not that high compared to previous prime ministers. They were, even when he came in, they were low, historically. So I think there is just a drift towards disappointment with Parliament, with politicians, and a sort of lack of trust that anything will ever change. So to that extent, I can see why a startup party could be disruptive. I mean, it's not just Dominic Cummings who has thought that. I mean, I recently wrote a piece in which those close to Tony Blair thought something similar was going to happen between 2017 and 19, when there were very serious pushes for a new party of the centre. Now, they'll be very different from what Dominic is pushing, but clearly there are serious players who understand British politics who think something new could come about. I'm a bit dubious about reform in this election. I mean, maybe I'll eat humble pie in 6 weeks' time. But I mean, I know that the Conservative Party think that the Reform voters at the moment are effectively kind of Tory ultras. They're a little bit like what UKIP used to be before it took off and it started to win in more northern heartlands. Now, that might not be the case, and Reform might do well, but by going early, he may have seen off the possibility of Nigel Farage coming back.
Because you spoke to Nigel quite recently, didn't you?
Yeah, and he was hinting very clearly that he was tempted, that he was leaning towards standing. Now, I think he's probably looked at the by-elections and thought, I don't think I'm going to be able to win, and I don't think he wants to go through that again. But I think if he stood a chance of winning, he would come back. But I mean, this is where the Conservative strategists think they have a chance, in that if they can squeeze reform down by saying your only alternative here is Keir Starmer, then they might be able to deny the Labour Party a majority.
Is there any chance they'll deny them an overall majority and we'll get a hung parliament?
Look, I don't think so. I think the mood in the country, I mean, it's hard to sort of grab hold of, isn't it? But it seems to me that it's pretty overwhelmingly anti-Tory at the moment. And for the reasons that we discussed at the beginning, the record is just so bad that it's very hard to see. I mean, it's very hard to meet people, isn't it, I think, these days, who
will say I'm voting Tory.
That I'm voting Tory. Where I think that felt different previously. Even when polls suggested that Ed Miliband might become Prime Minister, there wasn't that feeling in the country. Whereas today, it's just, there is kind of a visceral anti-Tory mood. I spoke to a Tory strategist earlier today who said it really depends on what happens to that mood in the next 6 weeks. Like, does it become overwhelming, where it rushes towards just defeating the Tories? Annihilation, yeah. Is that what the voters want here? And so will they vote for any party that will beat the Tories, whether that's the Liberal Democrats in the South, Labour Party in Scotland and in much of the rest of the country? Is that just going to just sweep the Tories out? And he was talking about 100 seats for the Conservatives at the end. But he also said that their highest aspirations are something like 220, which gives Labour a really big majority.
You're a Tory strategist. What's your take? Are we going to full annihilation territory, or do you have a genuine hope that a hung parliament might happen?
Hope is long since left, I think. I think we're more of a sort of Carthaginian defeat, really. I think if we're looking at this election, the average MRP would see 100 to 150 seats for the Conservatives. So I think it's going to be pretty gloomy. All elections are change or more of the same. We've seen Rishi come out, talk a lot in the last couple of weeks about the plan. That have been, boosted a bit on the inflation numbers. They're, constantly, we saw in his, on the steps today, stick with the plan. I've got a plan. Keir doesn't have a plan.
Realistically, it's very hard to see that the Rishi Sunak we saw on the steps of Downing Street a few minutes ago is going to suddenly capture the imagination of the electorate, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think if if you're going to be with us, the status quo, all the things we've assessed before of people fundamentally, whether it's the water companies and just not being able to get clean water through the taps, whether it's not being able to make a hospital appointment or get into see your doctor, finish crumbling schools, people feel that there's something structurally just broken.
Criminals
at the moment.
Being let out of prisons.
Criminals being let out of prisons. Extraordinary stories. We're seeing that sort of. We run a lot of sort of focus groups. With the organisation I now run, and constantly Charles B. Strategy, lovely plug, thank you. And that what constantly comes up is that people just want change. And I think, if you were going to be in either war room at the moment, I think if you're out and you're the change candidate in this election, you feel that you're swimming with the tide. I think it's incredibly difficult to make the case for the status quo when fundamentally people are incredibly unhappy.
Keir Starmer is not the change candidate, is he? I mean, we're going to go back to this almost sort of gaslighting mood between the two main parties where they exaggerate their differences, whilst a lot of people out there think they're really pretty similar. Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak are both basically centrist-ish technocrats. They have a similar view on the public spending. No one's going to be doing anything very radical. They won't have much money to play with anyway. Keir Starmer is kind of tacking to the centre. It all seems like back to the pre-2016 world, where the two main parties are either side of a kind of uni-party. Do you see it that way?
Yes, I do. I think there's very little between the parties. I think actually, you mentioned sort of Keir and Rishi are probably the two sides of the same coin in many ways. I think they're both good, decent, intelligent, hardworking men that probably aren't the most naturally political, and that's been a problem for both. I just think the winds are blowing in Keir Starmer's sails, but he's not really have to do very much to win this election. I think it's people just want to get rid of the Tory party.
He's just not a Tory.
Exactly.
That's his
and
only asset.
So that will be enough to get him into Downing Street, but it won't be enough to keep him there. And, he has to show immediately that he understands and can deliver the change. And I say, it wouldn't surprise me if within 6 to 12 months, we're seeing newspaper columns saying he's done a great job. He's, moved from Corbyn to number 10, but maybe it's time for something fresh and something new and young, and whether it's Wes, and we'll have that sort of Labour psychodrama of what comes next. I think that could happen incredibly quickly, which will shock people considering the scale of the majority I think that he's going to get.
So what about yourself then? Because since we got you here, you were so closely involved with the beginning of this government and Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings. And do you feel that the wrong argument won? Are there particular individuals who you blame? Why did it all go so wrong, and who should we blame?
I mean, I think it's probably no surprise that, I agree with much of Dominic's assessment from, my time within number 10. I think there was a plan for...
Summarise that for our viewers who might not have read his Twitter feeds.
Goodness, I don't think we'd have enough time to summarise his Twitter feeds. But I think broadly, as I say, we mentioned that the country wants, serious change. And there are considerable ways which I think the government does need to wholesale change how, government is run, civil service, through procurement, looking at, wholesale delivery of things. And I think that's sort of more of that axis that we saw, which is, higher public services and spending in those sort of spaces, but also sort of more conservative on things like crime and immigration, all those sorts of things. So trying to build that through. And I think, unfortunately, for Boris, we were hit with COVID, which I think was, a huge, significant issue that certainly slowed that sort of progress and momentum that we potentially would have had coming right out the election in 2019. And, during my time, that basically hit the 2 years that I was in Downing Street and we'd gone. But I think...
But the battle for Boris's brain had started before COVID hit, hadn't it? There was the sort of you and Dom project, which was this more radical idea, and it was state capacity, and it was the hard centre, or whatever you want to call it, where, as you say, you were going to be more comfortable with state intervention, but you're going to be quite kind of right-wing on culture issues. And then there were other people in his orbit who wanted a more timid, woke, whatever you want to call it, centrist dad kind of politics. That was the battle going on in number 10. And ultimately, you and Dom were kicked out and the other side won. Is that the story?
I think that, with all these things, it comes fundamentally down to, do you want to do something? Do you have a project to deliver? I think, whatever people think of Dominic, he had, an ideology, he had a vision for the country. I think perhaps for Boris, maybe he didn't have that very clear ideological view of like what he wanted the country to look like in 10 years' time. I think, felt very much that maybe it didn't need a huge amount of change and, we can sort of move along. And I think if, Partygate aside, he probably still had enough in the tank to beat Keir Starmer. I actually think one of the really interesting elements is I think part of Boris's problem is that he didn't fear Keir Starmer as a political opponent. I think we would have sessions for PMQs and he would, he'd sit there and we'd have a difficult day, whatever we were sort of working on. And he'd look up and say, expletive, we are not facing Tony Blair today, and sort of chuckle away. And, there was always a feel, I think he thought correctly, that I think he was too politically astute to be beaten by Keir Starmer no matter what the sort of scenario. So why go about having all this change and noise that, Dominic and others bring when I can win anyway and everything's sort of fine. So we can just go ahead. And I think, unfortunately, events then took over that removed him from the picture.
I'm going to play one final. I mean, this is a little bit ancient history, it already feels like, but it's still, since you're here, it does feel relevant. If we're thinking of alternative futures or alternative places we could be now, I think a lot of our viewers will be wondering whether COVID and the response to COVID is also part of the story of how everything went wrong. Because the moment that Boris decided to follow the rest of the countries in Europe and start doing lockdowns and start going down that path, to a lot of his more populist voters, perhaps it felt like he was just giving in. And after that, he became ill. His popularity gradually went down. and the whole energy went out of the project. Is there a parallel universe where he stuck to his original instinct, went with a Swedish-style response, and he'd still be Prime Minister today, calling an election that he might actually win?
I think that if Boris had ignored calls for a lockdown against all the scientific evidence that we'd received, and that if people were seeing family members, particularly elderly family members, die in huge numbers, and a government that could take action wasn't taking action, I think he'd have been out of Downing Street in very, very quick time, and his reputation would never have recovered. I think one of the great things that he did was deliver a lockdown and save a huge amount of lives. And actually, as a policy, there are a few policies that have proven more popular than lockdown. In huge numbers, the great public support it. Even now, I think it's still, people see its importance. I think actually, we don't need to rehash COVID, I'm sure. But if you look at the mistakes were made actually in the summer and the sort of second lockdowns in terms of that whole thing of like, we're going to unlock and everyone should get back to work and everything else. And that was a sort of disconnect of where public mood and sentiment was. And actually, if we'd have gotten that right, I think, he'd have been in better shape. But fundamentally, the vaccine rollout went incredibly well. People on the whole felt he did a really good job with COVID in a really challenging, difficult situation. And then, yes.
We could. I would happily do that for hours, but let's just...
We can save it for afterwards.
Let's return to the present day then. So Rishi, who eventually took over after the Truss episode, which I don't think we even need to spend time on, how has he done? It's almost, the mood is almost that he's kind of meh. He sort of did all right, but nobody feels like there was enough to him to actually change the story. I mean, what marks would you give him?
I think it's very difficult to say that he's done a good job. And I say, I've worked incredibly closely with Rishi. He's, again, I'll reiterate, he's a very hardworking, decent man, the sort of person that you would want in politics. But I think he just hasn't got the politics of the situation correct. If we look at something like small boats, we've seen the salience of an issue raised, and once again, a government failing to deliver on something. We've seen a government waiting lists being a key target, yet an NHS strike rumbling on. Everything just looks ineffective and lacks delivery. And I think, unfortunately, the public gave him a good window. After Liz, the Conservative Party reputation was obviously in a terrible state, but Rishi's numbers and viewpoints from the public was pretty good. It was, you've been a good chancellor, we'll give you an opportunity to show what you can do as a prime minister. And again, they sort of assessed that sort of core first 100 days and quite quickly after that lost faith in him because he hadn't got it right. And I think to try and be a status quo candidate in this environment where people want such change, I think he just got everything wrong.
He feels so much like a technocrat to people. And I know he would probably resist that label very passionately. He'll say, I've been doing my best on small boats. I wanted to keep Suella Braverman as Home Secretary. I was showing what a sort of sound Tory I was and everything. I'm not a soggy centrist. That's probably what he would say if we charged him with that. But it just looks like he's given up, doesn't it? It looks like his heart wasn't fully in it, or that maybe he was too much of a policy guy and just somehow politics he didn't really get it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, he looks like he's kind of shocked that his project that he probably mapped out on a spreadsheet hasn't worked. He expected to be winning an election. That's what, anybody who knows him will say, that he was incredibly confident when he came in. And I think you look in the conversation that you've just been having with Lee, there's such a shallowness to the Tory project, that once Partygate erupted, and dragged Boris Johnson from power, what has been the project? What has been the message? From that moment, the Tory party was in trouble, but it was Liz Truss's financial crisis that killed them. From that moment, they have never recovered. So the polls dropped and Rishi hasn't been able to pick them back up. It wasn't Partygate that killed the Tory chances, I don't think. I agree with Lee that I think actually if the Tory party had stuck with Johnson, they would be in a much better place than they are today. But Sunak is just not being able to shake that. And I think part of it is, what are you offering to people? Now, if we go back to Johnson, you think, what was his offer? It was unite and level up the country. Now, I think he once said to me that he was surprised how much that had sort of cottoned on, how much people had understood what it meant. And I think that even that gives you a sense of how shallow he kind of bought into it. And I think that gives you a sense of why Dominic was so frustrated with him, because he wasn't serious about something that Dominic and Lee clearly were serious about. So that was Johnson gone.
Just superficial.
Superficial. And Truss obviously doesn't believe in it at all and believes in something completely different. You know, what was a unite and level up? It was big state Toryism in many ways. It was higher public spending, more intervention, more focus on regions outside of the southeast.
Public spending they've got
after Truss because she blew everything up, right? So Truss came in, tried to do something different. It collapsed. No government wins after causing a financial crisis. That's another sort of economic lesson. It's never happened before. If you lead the country into a financial crisis, you're finished. The Tories tried to correct that by replacing Truss with Sunak, but they've never really been able to get past that. And what has Sunak offered? Does he believe in unite and level up, or does he believe in something different? I don't think it's very clear. It's just a sort of a superficial kind of mess.
It's almost like the project you're talking about, which is this big state Toryism. They used to call it red Toryism, blue Labour, that sort of territory. That was what they were elected on.
Exactly, yeah.
But possibly it's not even possible anymore. You know, I've noticed that the people who used to be enthusiastic about that are less so. There isn't any money to do that. It's not. I don't think anyone would now be saying, let's do a massive hike in public spending. The Labour Party certainly isn't saying that. And it's almost that the kind of radical thing to do now is the reverse. It's the Truss direction.
Well, it might be radical, but it didn't work. But I mean, I take your point.
Do you still feel that, whatever you want to call it, big state Toryism, all of that, do you still think that's the recipe? And that if only Rishi Sunak had done that, suddenly he'd be in a winning position?
Well, I think voters can sense whether somebody believes in something that they're selling. Sunak doesn't believe in that fundamentally. This is a teenager with posters of Margaret Thatcher on his wall. He's not that kind of Tory, like that, and people sense that. I mean, I think, yes, interest rates are much higher than they were. Borrowing is much higher after the pandemic. The government has less money. That is like a fundamental problem that Britain has.
They blew 300 billion.
Right. So
so
this is a fundamental problem that's going to make big state Toryism very difficult. But you can't, as a government, run a country with 7.5 million people on an NHS waiting list. You can't get a doctor's appointment, that you can't take your kids to A&E, that your schools are crap and crumbling, teachers are leaving. They're just like facts of life. Like, you have to get the economy growing. So, and Truss is right about that. But you also have to offer something on public services. It's just and they have offered nothing, and I think that is a fundamental problem.
I'm going to give you the final word here, Lee. What is your message to all of your kind of erstwhile voters, or the people who voted for the project you were in the middle of with Boris and Dom, all of those short numbers of years ago? Why should they bother voting Tory again when they didn't get what they were promised?
I think for me, I would say to those people that, we haven't delivered for them. We said we were going to bring about a huge amount of change, and that hasn't happened. And, I can rightly understand why people are angry and why people lose faith in politicians. And I think really that it's for politicians to start delivering for people. And, the things that Tom was mentioning of hospitals, schools and crime and all these things, these are people's lived experiences every day. There's a lot of people, in and around this particular postcode, and we, lots of, the who's up, who's down, lots of focus on all these sorts of things, all very exciting. But I think we lose sight too often on people's lived experience, and people feel that they're poorer, their life is worse than it's ever been. It's all very, very gloomy out there. I say any sort of focus groups and all that sort of stuff you spend time in, it's a really sobering reflection of how hard life is for people, and it is for whoever wins this election, whether it is Keir or Rishi Sunak, to really start to deliver for people, or we're going to see more and more people apathetic at best and looking for fringe options, or potentially at worst.
You sound pretty angry. Are you going to vote Tory?
I will almost certainly vote Tory, but it will be very difficult because I think there's not a lot of good options, I think, more than anything else.
There you have it. Lee Cain, Tom McTague, and thank you guys for watching. We are obviously going to pay close attention to this and see you very soon. This was an UnHerd special on the new general election.